Good morning. I'm Reverend Tom Capo, the minister here at the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of Vero Beach, and I want to wholeheartedly welcome all of you to this presentation this morning. Thank you so much for getting up on a Saturday morning and joining us here for this wonderful presentation. Now, before Dr. Butler gets up, I just want to say that this presentation was brought together by the Coalition for Racial Justice here at UUFVB and the Gifford Historical and Cultural Center. So I want to make sure that you're aware that that's the case, and that this is hopefully, our plan is to bring more and more of these educational experiences to Vero Beach in the coming year. If you have resources and know of people that you think might have something to say on the issue of Black history, please let us know. We're always open to new other speakers and presentations. I'll tell you more after Dr. Butler gets up here and shares some words of wisdom with us this morning. So, Dr. J. Michael Butler is the Keenan Distinguished Professor of History at Flagler College, where he has taught since 2008. His work has appeared in many peer-reviewed academic publications, such as American Studies, the Journal of Southern History, Southern Cultures, and more recently, the Journal of African American History. His book, Beyond Integration, The Black Freedom Struggle in Escambia County, Florida, 1960 to 1980, won a 2017 Florida Book Award in nonfiction. Dr. Butler, who received his PhD in history from the University of Mississippi, specializes in Southern cultural history with an emphasis on the Black freedom struggles. He teaches a number of classes on the topics and has spoken to dozens of teachers and community groups about the civil rights movement and African American history. Dr. Butler.
Good morning. I really appreciate y'all getting up so early on a Saturday morning to come and hear a presentation like this while it's still legal, right? The intro kind of gives a little bit about my background and what I specialize in, what I went to graduate school to do. And I often get the question of how does somebody who looks like you and talk like that get interested in this history? And the accent probably gives me away. I'm originally from LA, Lower Alabama. So, and the truth of the matter is that I knew absolutely nothing about the civil rights movement. I wanted to study the history of the South. I grew up in Alabama, of course, where a lot of the major campaigns of the movement occurred, what we call the master narrative from Birmingham, Montgomery, Selma, and it just wasn't taught. And what I thought I knew about the region that I grew up in and surrounded by, omitted the most important component. And as I got into graduate school and was exposed to the civil rights movement, basically what I learned is that you can't understand the contemporary South. I don't think you can understand modern America without understanding the centrality of the Black freedom struggle and its relevance as it still existed then and is even more true today. So the thing that I stress is that these topics are not a condemnation of who we are as America. It is. But it is a story of how the system was used to improve the system and guarantee the rights all citizens are guaranteed by the same Constitution. That's the quintessential American success story. A nonviolent revolution that made the nation live up to its principles and its ideals that it guaranteed to everyone equally, at least in theory. So that's sort of my motivation, and that's why I'm interested in these topics and remain constantly fascinated by these topics. But when we think about the civil rights movement, and I use that term master narrative because it's usually the 1954 to 1968 time period, right? Where most people think the civil rights movement started with Brown versus Board of Education. And it ended with the assassination of Dr. King in Memphis. That's an oversimplification, okay? The other component that I am going to talk about today is the role that Florida played in the movement then and as the greater black freedom struggle has progressed. Because Florida is a microcosm, not an outlier, of this nation's civil rights struggle. And that's one of the things that I want to stress in this presentation. If you take nothing from it, it's that Florida should be at the center of the way we understand the civil rights movement in America. Florida should be at the center of the way we understand contemporary race relations in the United States. I have a favorite documentarian who says the Florida of today is the America of tomorrow. And when it comes to this history, that's absolutely the case. So, the Florida civil rights movement, then and now. Why is Florida often left out of this master narrative, right? We talk about Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, the Carolinas, Tennessee, Louisiana. Well, because Florida has a specific perception that is based on investment. It's based on freedom, right? The free state of Florida. It's based on tourism. NASA. Citrus. It is, in the mind of America, Florida is the Sunshine State. And there's a postcard here that sort of reflects that. Palm trees, sunshine. Florida somehow is not like the rest of the nation in so many ways, and that carries over into the way most students and scholars have viewed the civil rights movement in this state, that Florida is different. This is a concept that's known as Florida exceptionalism. Florida exceptionalism. But if we go back to the very settlement of Florida, you see this ideal being propagated by even the Spanish. The Spanish thought it was unique. Upon settlement, it goes into the British colonization, into when it becomes an American territory and even a state, even into the 19th, going into the 20th century. People like Stephen Crane, William Bartram, Harriet Beecher Stowe, Henry Flagler, perpetuated this idea that Florida is different on so many different levels, that it's exotic, that it is like the Mediterranean of America, and so on and so forth. But if you just look a little bit beyond the surface, what you see is that Florida exceptionalism when it comes to race relations in this country is a myth. You see that in these postcards. The postcards are meant to attract visitors to the state. This is a time before TikTok and Instagram, social media, even camera phones. So how do stories of vacations and exotic getaways and sunshine and all of this good stuff, the Florida exceptionalism, how does it get back to people in the North? Through postcards. Tourism is always a part of these postcards, but look at the postcards themselves. What we see in the tourist literature is a clear assertion of white supremacy. In Florida, the message is that black people know their place. They are less than human. They are fit to publicize the slave market in St. Augustine. The old slave market is featured in that postcard. By the way, that postcard is still sold in some places, St. Augustine, where the elderly African-American gentleman standing in front is meant to remind people of a time that has passed that was better. Those were the days, right? This is when America was great. This is a throwback to a concept called the lost cause. I won't go into that right now. But one of the things that I stress in many of my lectures, when people find out that I'm a history professor and they tell me how much they love history, I love history. Most of the time, they love nostalgia. They don't love history. History's difficult. History doesn't care about the way it makes us feel. History's complex. History is relevant. Nostalgia is this imagined past that never existed that's created to reinforce contemporary political worldviews. Okay? That's nostalgia. We love nostalgia because it makes us feel good. We hate history sometimes because it makes us think. And what these postcards do is make you think about the place of black people in the state of Florida at the time that they were produced. We have black people as comic figures, as inferior. These are called, forgive the expression, they're called coon cards. And Florida produced more than any other single state that I've seen, basing it on alligators, basing it on citrus, basing it on palm trees, and you can see an African American in a palm tree running. You see another African American in the back running away from the alligators, which makes it unique. Honey, come down, we're waiting for you in Florida. We have, again, like I said, the slave market, which is a throwback to the antebellum period when things were much easier to understand during that period. And then we have the infamous A Darky's Prayer. These gators look so fiery. And now that I've done met them, I'll never be the same, right, in black vernacular. This is an assertion of white supremacy, this idea that African Americans are culturally, intellectually, mentally, socially inferior and can never reach the same status as white people. Even institutions like the St. Pete Alligator Farm made light of black bodies. Alligator bait. This was seen as humorous. This was seen as unique. And it reinforced that black lives did not matter. So just with postcards, just with tourist items, which is uniquely Florida, right? The role that race played is undeniable. So instead of being at the periphery of our nation's race relations and the nation's civil rights struggle, because this is what the movement combats, the idea of black inferiority. Florida should be at the center of the way we understand the movement. Now, I have 4 reasons, right? Because Florida is interesting as a microcosm. You can use Florida as a prism to understand how the local, the state movements, and national campaigns all intersect, right? So I use Florida in the Florida Civil Rights History class that I teach to say that Florida both reflects national trends and influences national trends when it comes to the movement. You can understand the movement big picture by understanding Florida's struggle. And one of the ways that you can do that is by emphasizing the racially motivated violence that existed in this state. So the first reason that Florida should be at the center of our nation's civil rights struggle is a comprehension of the violence that characterized this state. Between 1880 and 1930, the high period of lynching in this country. Lynching is when an individual or a group of people are held accountable by a group for an alleged crime and punished outside of the justice system. You know, to simplify it, it's when the majority of a community take law into their own hands and act as judge, jury, and executioner. They think that the criminal justice system is too lenient and too slow, and this leads to mass lynchings. Oh, by the way, lynchings were often captured as postcards. So we know that these lynchings existed because communities preserved them as a relic of how race relations are in that particular area, right? So we know that from 1880 to 1930, Florida led the nation in per capita lynchings. Twice the lynching rate of Mississippi, 3 times the lynching rate of Alabama. Okay, so think about it. From 1880 to 1930, it was 3 times more dangerous for a black person to live in Florida than to live in Alabama. That is the first fact that gets us into this idea that violence permeated race relations in this state since the end of Reconstruction and into the 20th century. But let's start with the 20th century. Let's dive into the 20th century and talk about events that occurred at the national level that influenced local events and local events that had national impact. Let's start in 1920 with the Ocoee Massacre. Okay, 1920 was a presidential election year. 1920 was the first year that women could vote, and black women were being mobilized to vote to cast their ballots in the state of Florida. In the early 20th century, Florida had the first organized statewide civil rights movement, and it focused on the vote, and it focused on African Americans joining the Republican Party, the Party of Emancipation, the Party of Lincoln. The white South was the Democratic South. Okay, that's going to change, and we're going to look to Florida to see when, by the way. 1920, in Ocoee, during the presidential election, an individual tried to cast their ballot as groups were preparing others to do across the state. But in Ocoee, the white power structure was ready. Local men armed with guns waited. There's no federal jurisdiction of the vote during this time, by the way, guys. We don't get that until 1965. Okay? Elections are left in the hands of local municipalities and the state. So it was anything goes. Literally, to cast a ballot in 1920, and civil rights groups were telling their constituents that you are literally taking your life into your own hands. So in Ocoee, with an armed posse turning black people away, one black gentleman showed up with his own gun, determined to cast his ballot. He's chased away, he's shot at. He goes to the home of an individual in Ocoee named July Perry. July Perry was a landowner. And if you're a landowner in Florida during this time, you are a target because you don't depend on white people for your livelihood. What happens in Ocoee is that groups of organized white terrorists from throughout the region, from Lakeland to Leesburg to Orlando, come to Ocoee armed with the determination to rid the community of the black presence in its entirety. The Ocoee Massacre, as it became known, was a week-long clearance in which women and children are shot and killed, all because black men in particular tried to exercise their right to vote. After a week, Ocoee had ridded itself of its black population. The people who survived left, and they never returned to claim their property. The NAACP investigation that occurred in Ocoee in the aftermath concluded that at least 56 people died. If you stopped there, it is the single worst day, it's the single worst episode of election day violence in American history. You know, when we were talking about the last election and will there be violence and how unprecedented that will be, the first thing I thought about was Ocoee, and I'm like, it's not unprecedented. And when I say 56, I mean that's 56 documented. There were dozens more who are still unaccounted for. It lasted a week, and it did not target the single individual who tried to vote, but it targeted the entire black community. This is a form of racial violence that usually, when scholars look at it, characterize northern states. I mean, you think Black Wall Street in Tulsa, you think Chicago 1919, you think St. Louis, and communities that are targeted. Usually those are outside of the South, but what Florida demonstrates is that no, these clearances, this community-wide violence existed in this state. We see it again exercised, but for different reasons, 3 years later in Rosewood. Now, Rosewood is one of those episodes that you may have heard about that characterizes Florida's history. It started the way that so many other racially motivated pogroms began. And there are reasons for it, and I go into it in my classes. We don't really have time to get into it this morning, but it's the allegation of sexual assault against a black man made by a white woman. Bogus in Rosewood, as it was bogus in so many other instances. But if you ever, as a white female, wanted to turn attention away from the accusation to a community, you said that a black man sexually assaulted me. That's what happened in Rosewood. And it was the same situation. Several miles away, a black community that was thriving, a black community that was economically self-sufficient, is targeted for being, the word was uppity, too uppity. They have gotten out of their so-called place. So what happened in Rosewood in January of 1923 is a week-long campaign against the entire community in which, house by house and property by property, people are killed, chased from their property, hiding in the swamp at night, and eventually leaving the region entirely, some never to return. Dozens are killed during this week-long episode of violence in Rosewood. And we didn't know about it at the national level until 1983. The terror was so great that it was something that few ever wanted to discuss again. Some out of fear, some because of the psychological damage that that period caused and a desire to just move on. So Rosewood, Ocoee, clearances. Entire communities are targeted. But also lynching characterized the Sunshine State. 1934 in Marianna. North Florida, the Panhandle, right? And one of the things that I've seen in the Panhandle, and I have my theories, because the population is so rural, because the population is so thin, African Americans had more access to land. So any economic self-sufficiency, any land ownership made black people a target, particularly of whites who did not own land, right? And we see that in North Florida and Marianna. Now, Claude Neal, once again, wrong place, wrong time, was accused of raping and murdering a white girl. Reviewing the evidence, I'm not sure it would have held up in a court of law. There was a lot of what we would call today circumstantial evidence, but what happens to Claude Neal characterized what is called a spectacle lynching. A spectacle lynching is when a person is captured, they're held in jail while the community plans for their ultimate lynching. And that lynching is carried out in front of a crowd that has been told in advance where and when it would occur. And there's a system, almost ritualized torture and degradation, followed by murder, leaving the body in a prominent public space in front of a courthouse, because that's justice in the Jim Crow South, followed by the entire black community being targeted by white mobs. The first person that wrote about Claude Neal, James McGovern, he said that it was the last spectacle lynching in American history. He was wrong. But if you want to understand what lynching entailed, all you have to do is look to Marianna in 1934. Groveland, 1948. The subject of a Pulitzer Prize-winning book by journalist Gilbert King, Devil in the Grove. And this is a story that is pretty remarkable. Again, Groveland, large citrus industry. It depended on cheap black labor, and I'm going to talk more about that in a minute. But long story short, what Groveland demonstrates is the power of economics and the power of local law enforcement to rule their jurisdictions when it comes to race with an iron fist. Willis McCall was the sheriff in Groveland at the time. Here's Willis McCall here and here. Once again, the Groveland Four young men who were accused questionable evidence at best, but were accused of raping a 17-year-old white woman. 2 of the Groveland 4 were not even in the city when it happened, when the alleged assault happened. But it didn't matter. They were arrested by McCall. There was an attempted lynching. One of the boys escaped because they knew that McCall was coming for him. He assembled a posse of about 2,000 people, literally hunted him down, and he was killed by what the coroner documented as 400 separate gunshot entries. Right? The remaining 3 were put on trial, given the death sentence, forced coercion. There was one person who never confessed. Their situation and the evidence that did not exist and the force that was used to get a coerced confession attracted the attention of the NAACP at the national level. Thurgood Marshall himself, who even at the time was called Mr. Civil Rights, came to Groveland because he wanted to use the Groveland case as a way to attack the death penalty, capital punishment, when it came to sexual assault. The Supreme Court agreed and ordered that the Groveland boys get a new trial. There were 2 who were adults. One was a minor. The NAACP did not want to go to trial because that minor was now an adult, and as an adult, he would get the death penalty. So the 2 adults who had the death penalty levied against them, McCall basically said, I will drive them from Rayford back to Groveland, back to Lakeland in my own vehicle. Back to Groveland, not Lakeland. In my own vehicle. They were chained by their feet and by their wrists. McCall claimed that his car had a flat tire. When he stopped to check it, he was attacked. So both of the boys were shot. One's killed in cold blood. The other was shot 4 times and survived, and said that they were executed by McCall. It was an attempted execution. Okay? This story gained national and even international attention. An all-white jury said that McCall acted in self-defense, and there was never any accountability for what happened to the Groveland 4. So many different things then that you could use to understand the state of race relations in the South and in America at that time by just looking at the Groveland case. By the way, on the national level, again, how Florida informs national movements and national events. Because the NAACP publicized the Groveland case so successfully and tried to build support for a federal anti-lynching law, right? It failed, but they raised so much money that it funded, according to Thurgood Marshall, it funded Brown v. Board. So Thurgood Marshall always said that Groveland, yes, it ultimately saved the lives of the 2 because they were given life in sentence and not the death penalty. And eventually they were freed because of time. Not exonerated until 2020 that they were pardoned, finally. But Thurgood Marshall always said it was Groveland that provided the NAACP Legal Defense Fund the financial backing to successfully fund what became known as the Brown versus Board of Education decision in 1954. So again, Florida reflecting, contributing to national campaigns. Harry T. Moore, 1951, not far from here. Mims, Florida. Harry T. Moore was the first full-time paid state secretary of the NAACP in any state. Harry T. Moore investigated lynchings. Harry T. Moore investigated voter discrimination. Harry T. Moore filed a lawsuit to equalize teacher salaries for black and white teachers in the state of Florida. Harry T. Moore was an absolute albatross hanging around the neck of white supremacists in this state. He investigated Groveland. and actually got the testimonies from the young man who survived Willis McCall's assassination attempt. That made him a marked man. And on Christmas night of 1951, the date of his 25th wedding anniversary, Klansmen that we know who composed this group placed dynamite under his bedroom floor and successfully assassinated Harry T. Moore and his wife, Harriet, who died days later. Harry T. Moore was the first NAACP official in this nation assassinated for their civil rights activities. The book that's written about Harry T. Moore is titled Before His Time. And if his assassination would have come later, his name would be in history books today. But as it stands, even people in Florida maybe have only heard the name Harry T. Moore because it graces the county courthouse or has a local park named in his honor. But Harry T. Moore literally gave his life for the cause of racial and political justice. Axe Handle Saturday in 1960 in Jacksonville. Again, a microcosm of what's going on in the rest of the South. And what's going on in the rest of the South at this time is a nonviolent revolution that young people are joining in droves. It started on February 1st, 1960 in Greensboro, North Carolina, the sit-in movement. It's a simple strategy. Department stores would sell clothes. They would sell items to African American customers. They would allow African American customers to even buy food from their luncheon areas, but they could not enter the luncheon area and sit and eat. They had to take their food, usually getting it from a back door or a side window. They had to take it to a segregated park and eat it there. These four young men in North Carolina, who were students at North Carolina A&T, decided that they would follow Dr. King's philosophies from Montgomery and violate an immoral law by ignoring it. It started, as I said, a nonviolent revolution that made the most important component of this campaign bravery and courage and a willingness to endure suffering, arrests, incarceration. It came to Florida as well. And we think that, it's often taught, that the student movement, that the sit-ins killed Jim Crow. But what we often forget is that there is violent resistance to any form of racial progress in this country's history all the time. Look at Jacksonville in 1960. Local whites hear that there is a planned demonstration on a July Saturday in downtown Jacksonville to integrate lunch counters. So what happens? Law enforcement is conveniently not there while white men are passing out axe handles to greet the demonstrators with violence, and they use it. The newspaper didn't cover what became known as Axe Handle Saturday because that was bad for business. You didn't want potential investors and corporations and industries looking at a southern city, a city in Florida, when business in Florida was good and say, they've got racial problems, so we're not going to go there. But we know from firsthand testimony, and we know from a handful of photographs like the one that you see here, that with campaign comes violent resistance. And the sit-ins did not work. They were not successful in Jacksonville on that Saturday. It would take time, and it would take the courage of local people to bring about that change. This is the home of Harry T. Moore in Mims. The explosion was so loud that the blast was heard 4 miles away in Titusville. Okay. The Klan in Florida. Now, I have a separate lecture on the Ku Klux Klan in Florida. It is easy to believe that the Klan is one single unit, one single group, and it's not. You know, one of the things about the Ku Klux Klan that I emphasize is that, yeah, it's organized white terrorism. But it's organized white terrorism that has several different waves of influence, and it's more powerful at sometimes in history than it is in others. What we can say about the Klan in Florida, and the book that has been written titled The Invisible Empire about the Ku Klux Klan in Florida, is that nationally speaking, the Florida Klan is larger in number and it's more consistent in the power that it exerted over a longer period of time. So you can learn about the Klan and how it operated by examining Florida, but you can also understand a lot about Florida race relations by comprehending that the Klan is bigger and stronger in Florida for longer than it is in any other southern state. So I have this photograph, and there are numerous photographs of the Klan in Florida because it was not seen as something to be ashamed of if you're a white person. The contrary. It's a mark of civic pride. As a matter of fact, in Miami, there was a time where Klan membership was required for police officers. Required. Okay? So we have Callahan, which is in Nassau County in North Florida, not far from Duval, Jacksonville, right? And you have a massive cross burning and membership drive. 1956 is important because this is the year in Florida that Klan membership begins to grow again, and it's in the aftermath of Brown v. Board. Right? So anytime there is racial progress, there's going to be an inevitable white, angry backlash. We learn from history that we learn nothing from history, right? You see the men, but look at the children. That's what always kind of stands out to me. You see women, you see children. This is not just men. There are women's auxiliary units, and there are children who are being inculcated in the culture of white supremacy, because that's what it's about. St. Augustine, 1964. The only campaign in Florida that SCLC came in to support. SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, obviously. This is the organization of Dr. King. And this is the only place in Florida where Dr. King was ever arrested. Something that the city doesn't put in their tourism material, obviously, right? But the timing here is important. The timing is important because in 1964, SCLC is riding a wave of success after Birmingham, after the March on Washington, both of which were 1963. John F. Kennedy, before his assassination, had promised and delivered a Civil Rights Act to Congress. What SCLC and King had learned in Birmingham was that instead of fighting these battles on a case-by-case basis and going to different southern cities, we can kill Jim Crow with one piece of legislation, and that legislation was the Civil Rights Act. Fast forward to the autumn of 63 into 1964, and local people in St. Augustine are facing tremendous white resistance on every level. Now, I'm going to talk about who initiated that formal organized movement. It's important. But he asked for assistance. He asked for national help, and the SCLC came in. Well, when Dr. King visited the city in the midst of this struggle, the Civil Rights Act was working its way through the Senate to much opposition. King was very concerned that St. Augustine had the potential of a tinderbox and would blow up and sabotage the Civil Rights Act, so he wanted SCLC out of St. Augustine. That didn't happen. There's a bigger story pertaining to why, but if you want to understand the fragility of the Civil Rights Act ever becoming law, and the role that organizations played in consciously trying to support or not support local campaigns, you would do no worse than to look at St. Augustine as a microcosm. Dr. King is in St. Augustine when the Civil Rights Act is passed. Right? Andrew Young told me, and that sounds like very pretentious, but it's true. It's true. I've had a chance to talk to Andrew Young about his time in St. Augustine because Andrew Young basically becomes the point man of the St. Augustine campaign, right? And what Andrew Young told me was that St. Augustine was the only SCLC campaign in which medical costs exceeded legal fees. That's how violent it was on a daily basis. They said it was worse than Birmingham because it was so persistent. The day before the Civil Rights Act vote was held, a swim-in was held at a local pool. The media was alerted. A white guest invited his friends to join him in the pool. And when they did, the owner lost his mind. His name was Jimmy Brock, and he grabbed 2 gallons of muriatic acid and began pouring them into the swimming pool to get the black people out of the water. A photographer captured this image. And the faces of the African Americans in the pool say it all. I have a colleague whose husband is from Italy, and when I've talked about the St. Augustine movement before, and they were there, and he later told me this photograph was in their history textbooks in Italy. That this was when Jim Crow and segregation and the movement, that section in their American history came up. That was the photograph that demonstrated the racial hate that characterized America at the time. Well, it's important locally, it's important nationally, because this is the photograph that's on the cover of D.C. newspapers the next day when the Civil Rights Act vote was held. It was an example of what that act had to change. National significance occurring in our state and communities. 68, Miami. 75, Pensacola. I use these 2 examples to demonstrate that you can look into Florida history and understand how the movement doesn't change with the passage of the Civil Rights Act. Well, the movement doesn't end, it changes with the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 64 and the Voting Rights Act in 65. In 1968, the Republican National Convention was being held in Miami because of the economic and housing issues that existed in Overton and other places in Miami that had rigid segregation, poor educational facilities, no economic opportunity. There was a movement to include African Americans in the formal process. The governor responded by sending in the National Guard and cordoning off access to the properties and breaking up demonstrations, which led to resistance. The Republican Party was for white only. The state government looked at any protests or demonstrations as potentially dangerous. Force is used, which sparks more violence and a reaction. Again, the Florida of today is the America of tomorrow. In Pensacola in 1975, my research, the book that I published, it's really engaging to me and fascinating to me because it focuses on 2 issues that were called civil rights topics at the time that white power brokers said, no, this has nothing to do with the movement. Why aren't you people satisfied? Why can't you be happy with integration? Basically, it was the murder of black motorists under questionable circumstances by white law enforcement and the presence of Confederate images in public schools. The largest, least segregated school in Escambia County chose as their nickname in the 1950s, the Rebels. And a court case that targeted these symbols, the Johnny Reb mascot, the Confederate flag banner, a federal judge determined that because they were, quote, racial irritants, they violated the spirit of Brown v. Board. So in Pensacola, we have 2 issues that still divide us today. The presence of Confederate imagery, the survival of the lost cause mentality, and the unchecked use of force, often lethal, against black citizens in our communities. Issues that still divide us today. They were identified as civil rights issues in the 1970s. The McDuffie riots. two others that follow them in Miami. Again, another example of law enforcement murdering a black person, framing it as an accident, and an all-white jury letting them off scot-free of their crime, leads to an uprising. And Dr. King called riots, by the way, the language of the unheard. Trayvon Martin, 2012, the hoodie, stand your ground, another black death, demonstrates the problem we have in this country with vigilante justice that's directed at perceived threats. Violence, then, on many different levels, both reflect the development of race relations in this state and influence national trends. The second thing that I think is important in terms of why Florida should be at the center of our nation's civil rights history is because of the sheer size of the state, okay? Now, I think one of the reasons, and many scholars believe that one of the reasons that the civil rights movement in Florida often is ignored in favor of the larger state campaigns is because after 1920, there's no one major statewide campaign that an organization leads in Florida. In other words, this is very top-down history. We think that a great leader, Dr. King, or an organization like the NAACP will come in and organize people across city boundaries and for one great purpose. And that just doesn't happen in Florida. One of the things we were talking about last night is how in the civil rights movement in Florida, it's local issues that matter most. In Florida, more so than in any other state, except maybe Mississippi, and there was a degree of state mobilization in Mississippi that you don't see in Florida, but it's driven by local interests. And because the state is so large, what matters in a specific community at different times is different. It could be economics. It could be tourism. It could be police brutality. It could be lynching. It could be the vote, right? So in Florida, one of the things that I think is really interesting is to look at the issues that mattered in urban and rural areas. And it unlocks a lot about what the campaigns in Florida looked like. Now, oftentimes, because Florida was a predominantly rural state through the 20th century, that it is black labor and labor-related issues that are the primary civil rights issue for rural communities, okay? That explains where, for instance, the convict lease system comes in. Florida founded a system of racially based oppression that targeted black men to work out of state prisons at leased rates. Now, the convict lease system, it criminalized so-called black crimes, vagrancy, loitering, even something as simple as chicken theft, because it was seen as a black crime, so the punishment was severe. Vagrancy was not being able to provide evidence that you were employed. So if you're a black person, you had to demonstrate evidence of employment at all times. Otherwise, if a law enforcement officer asked you for your proof and you didn't have it, you faced 5 years at hard labor and a $5,000 penalty for not having a job. Why did that happen? Because after emancipation, landowners don't lose their land. That's one of the failures of Reconstruction, is that there's not the 40 acres and a mule land redistribution across the board that was so needed for economic justice, okay? So landowners keep their land, but they lose their laborers because of emancipation. Well, you can pay cheap wages, but if there's too much movement, if the workforce is unstable, that's bad for business if you're a grove owner in Central Florida. What the convict lease system did then was that it increased the number of black men in state custody And it said, because you're a ward of the state and you owe this hefty fine, you can be leased out to corporations, to landowners, for pennies a week to satisfy your debt. Turpentine camps, citrus groves, railroad companies are the largest beneficiaries of convict lease. And there's a picture there to the left of convict lease labor. I mean, the songs about chain gangs and movies about men being worked, that comes from Florida. Florida was the template for so many other southern states to implement their own convict lease system. And only Alabama's convict lease system lasted longer than ours. Now, in urban areas where tourism is the big industry, then the movement targets segregation in recreational spaces like beaches. This is something that students always, it kind of blows their mind. How can you segregate the ocean? Right? And it's like, look, if you're trying to rationalize Jim Crow, you're going to drive yourself nuts because there is no reasonable explanation for racial segregation at all. It's an assertion of power is what it's about. The beach is segregated because we control who goes to the beach and you can't. That's what Jim Crow is all about. But in places like Tampa and St. Pete and Miami, St. Augustine, sometimes African Americans had absolutely no access to beaches at all. Sometimes it was to a segregated beach. So, in order to use the economics of a location, campaigns were built around beach integration, for instance. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes blacks got their own beach. Sometimes beaches are integrated. Sometimes it didn't. But in looking through cities and rural communities in Florida, because there is no single organized statewide civil rights movement at any time, you can understand how campaigns are formed, take shape, and how leadership emerges in these communities to become the civil rights leaders that characterized the period. For me, and this is the least exciting part of the presentation, I think, right? But the way that politics are used to slow the pace of integration to a crawl was deliberate, and it was perfected here. Okay, you see, there's this phenomenon that scholars talk about. It's called the implementer's revenge. And it makes sense. The same people in positions of political leadership that oppose segregation, that oppose desegregation, are often the same people in power when they have to implement it. Because that change is coming from the outside. It's coming from a federal government or federal court cases. It's not coming from inside the state, right? The call is not coming from inside the house. And the political officials that have to implement that integration plan were the same ones who opposed any form of integration, sometimes literally days earlier. So what we see in Florida is an example of how state and counties collude to avoid meaningful integration plans. Case in point, Brown v. Board. Brown v. Board, of course, announced by the Supreme Court in a unanimous decision in May of 1954. Separate but equal in the field of education is inherently unconstitutional. Great. But one of the drawbacks of Brown was that it had no implementation timeline. When do schools have to integrate? When do states have to develop these integration plans? The Attorney General of Florida developed a strategy. His name was Richard Irvin. Part of that strategy was, the mindset is, it took 300 years to integrate this nation. We had 300 years of slavery and segregation. It's going to take at least 300 years to integrate our schools. Okay? So, the plan that he developed, which all Southern governors adopted, became the foundation for, in 1955, the ratification of Brown II. And what Brown II said was that schools had to integrate in the South, quote, at all deliberate speed. What does that mean? It's intentionally vague. And what I learned last night was this county is still under a federal desegregation order. 2025. The Florida of today is the America of tomorrow. How does this happen? Because school integration plans are sent to the states. And Florida, politically, embraced a doctrine of stonewalling, delaying, and tokenism, not massive resistance. Alabama and George Wallace adopted massive resistance. Ross Barnett in Mississippi adopted massive resistance. And what massive resistance does is it basically forces a showdown with the federal government. If you're going to tell James Meredith he can't be admitted into the University of Mississippi in violation of a federal injunction, the National Guard and federal marshals are coming to town, and they did. Same thing in Alabama with George Wallace and the University of Alabama. But that doesn't happen in Florida, deliberately. So while the state seems more moderate, because their governor isn't a belligerent Jim Crow, segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever proponent, then Florida got to do the very minimum and still does the very minimum to meet federal integration guidelines in a way to slow meaningful desegregation to a crawl. The example that I give is the Florida Pupil Assignment Law of 1956. Now, this is another example of how Florida uses legislation to stymie meaningful integration, okay? So, again, every state, according to the Department of Education, states had to develop their own plan for integration. It's enforced by the Department of Education, and if you think the Department of Education is important in enforcing these things, you would be right in assuming that it is, because without the Department of Education, without a federal agency making sure that states follow through on their plans, the states have no accountability at all. The state can do whatever the hell it wants. And in 1956, what Florida determined is that integration plans would be determined on a county-by-county basis in Florida. Does anybody know how many counties? 67, very good. 67 counties in the state of Florida, the same as existed in 1956. There would be 67 different integration plans, so that the onus for integration is placed on black parents, and the rules were determined by local school boards. If there was a lawsuit, that lawsuit would first be directed not at the state, but at the county, and it would have to advance through the court system. It was expensive, and it took a tremendous amount of time to litigate. That was deliberate. That's stonewalling. What the Florida Pupil Assignment Law said, and this is where I'm reading this because I want to give this the accuracy it deserves. County school boards had to develop plans which considered, quote, the sociological, psychological, and other social scientific factors as will prevent socioeconomic class consciousness among pupils when determining school assignment. Yeah, what is the right answer? For more, school boards were told they must consider, quote, the scholastic aptitude, intelligence, and mental energy and ability of every black applicant. Yes, for every black applicant, for every student who wanted to enter a school that was not in their district, which is a black kid, right? So the standards are so vague that it meant that integration would occur on a token level only. The impetus on desegregating schools was not the school system, it's the black parent. And if you look at different counties and the different policies, some of the things that occurred are crazy. Like school districts in Escambia, they basically said you have 1 week to file a petition to have your child put in a different school, and parents had to appear before the school board between 10 and 1 on Monday to make their case. Right? So it made it extremely impossible, which slows it to a crawl. 1961, the first integrated school was in Miami, Orchard Villa, 4 students. Another problem. Dozens of applications, by the way, but only 4 students were chosen to integrate. But another issue, within 2 years, Orchard Villa was 90% black. So the presence of 4 black kids meant that a majority of white parents pulled their kids out of the school and used pupil assignment to go elsewhere, which leads to resegregation, which means that's why we're still under a federal court order in some counties, right? In 1966, 90% of students in Florida public schools, 90% of students in public schools in 1966 attended segregated academies. 90% in 1966, 12 years after Brown, attended segregated schools. I talk a little in the longer version about Leroy Collins, and I'll give you a thumbnail on Leroy Collins because I think he's the poster child for this political stonewalling, right? For Collins, he is the first Southern governor to speak in favor of representing all citizens equally. So he's often called, he was determined by the Miami News Herald, the Floridian of his century, right? And he is seen as a moderate when compared to George Wallace, but Genghis Khan is kind of a moderate compared to George Wallace, right? And because he made that statement of, I am the governor for all citizens, black or white, even though he had criticized the NAACP and Brown years before, what often isn't mentioned, though, is that Leroy Collins made that speech in March of 1960, which was the last year he could hold the office of governor. He was a lame duck governor. And when he had absolutely nothing to lose, then he said, I'm a governor for all people, black or white. Collins was a segregationist up to that point. So image, perception in Florida often mean more than policy and reality. Something, again, which demonstrates that the Florida of today is the America of tomorrow. But I don't want to leave on a totally negative note. I want to talk about activism, right? It's easy to decry the state of race relations in Florida because it's not good. It's a microcosm for the nation's struggles as a whole. But because the movement in Florida is localized, that means that you can find heroes at the local level. Anywhere you go, wherever you look, it's local people who put their lives on the line to make this country stand up to the principles that it made to all equally. Harry T. Moore, 1951. Because of his efforts, the black voting percentage, black registration percentage in Florida went from 5% to 31% in less than 5 years. He's assassinated for that. H.K. Matthews, Pensacola, Florida. He is the person that said the civil rights movement is not over. Law enforcement and the violence that they use against black people, Confederate images that are used to intimidate, taunt, humiliate black students. These are civil rights issues. He's sent to prison on trumped-up charges of threatening to assassinate a sheriff. It's an incredible story. But he paid for a period with his own freedom. C.K. Steele, the vice president of the SCLC when it's formed, brought the Montgomery bus boycott to Tallahassee. He organized the Tallahassee bus boycotts before he knew how Montgomery would end. And you can see in front of his church, he's holding a burnt cross. Mary McLeod Bethune, educator par excellence, member of FDR's unofficial, quote-unquote, black cabinet, an advisor on African-American issues at the federal level who had an impact locally first. Robert Haling, a dentist in St. Augustine, who was nearly lynched and asks for outside help. If not for Robert Haling, Andrew Young and Martin Luther King do not come to St. Augustine, and we don't have that photograph that was on the cover of the Washington newspapers the day of the vote that ended the longest filibuster in American history. Students from Florida A&M in Tallahassee who organized a citywide downtown struggle to integrate facilities, from lunch counters to movie theaters to bus stations. Students unite and bring change to their communities. And the list goes on and on. But the relevance of this topic is what makes it so important. You know, there are a few topics in history that you can discuss that have the visual and contemporary relevance that discussing race relations in this country in 2025 have. Without understanding this history, without understanding the legacy of racial injustice in this country, you're still going to have public officials release photographs of them posing in Klan outfits and thinking that it's just a Halloween costume. When they're removed from office, there's a public outcry. Why does this matter? History is because it matters. You have indoctrination when it comes to whose stories are told in this state and whose aren't. Because these stories are hard, they're uncomfortable. They make us face up to the reality of how we have treated fellow citizens. And for some, that compromises their nostalgia. You have a legacy of violence that once is the Klan but has evolved into Proud Boys. That is a legacy of using intimidation and terror to keep minorities in fear. You have the power of symbols. Confederate symbols, white Klan hoods, swastikas, Nazi flags. The history gives it relevance. The history gives it relevance. And it sends a message that the people who use those symbols know that it's sending. But maybe more importantly, the importance of telling the story is in and of itself a form of activism. Education has always in this country been activism. The reason we have a public system of education in this country is because of Reconstruction and the promises that were made to the children of American citizens whose birthright guaranteed them citizenship. It's in the Constitution. If it's in the Constitution, it can't be unconstitutional. I don't know how to say that enough. Okay? For the time being, yes. Reconstruction is why we have a public education system that operates at the federal level. But for some, these stories are controversial. They're uncomfortable, and they should be, right? They're unsettling. For some, they're divisive, right? These stories help us understand what it means to be an American, warts and all. It's not intended to make us hate each other, a specific race, or Americans. But history is often politicized by bad faith actors. And I have encountered that firsthand. The Florida of today is the America of tomorrow. In January of 2022, long before DEI and divisive concepts and student comfort were our barometers for historical education, we had a phrase that called these topics woke. We even had legislation that was passed in January of 22 that intended to, as the legislation put it, stop woke. I've had an opportunity to speak to many different teachers groups throughout the state, and I was scheduled in January of 2020 to speak to a group in Osceola County, educators from K through 8, to give their teachers ideas and sources for Black History Month, which was just around the corner. without talking to me, without talking to the organization that supported me, the National Council for History Education, by the way, the school board decided that the easiest thing to do would be to cancel the seminar in its entirety. And they said, in writing, that in light of the conversations we're having at the state level about critical race theory, we believe that it's best to indefinitely postpone this series. I did not know that CRT stood for Civil Rights Training as much as it did critical race theory, but obviously it does. So this is where, and this is not something that is motivated by me personally. It's something that's motivated by the history that I teach. How hypocritical would I be in telling these stories of people who sacrificed a lot more than most of us have, including their lives, to not insist upon the right to tell their stories? So I did. I went public, and it became a national story. Can states prevent the teaching of civil rights history? I answered with one word: yes. They did. That seminar has yet to be held, by the way, in Osceola County. Okay? But it was too woke because it made teachers nervous, and it made students uncomfortable, and it made parents mad. Why does this history matter? Because it informs who we have been as a country and still are as a country. And if the past doesn't repeat itself, which it doesn't, as Mark Twain said, it most assuredly rhymes. A hallmark of totalitarian regimes has been to silence the media and persecute intellectuals. If you can rewrite the past, you can dominate the contemporary. And if this history makes you uncomfortable, good. Because it's pretty uncomfortable to learn about the history of racial violence and injustices in this country and not want to do something about it. So the importance, I always leave my classes with a slide that reinforces what did we learn today? What we learned today is that I hope Florida, as you now comprehend, should not be at the periphery of the way we understand the civil rights movement in this nation, but should be at the center. That in Florida you see an intersection of local, state, and national trends that have influenced communities like ours and the nation as a whole. We've learned that class, economics, political delay matter. We've learned that perception means more than reality. But most importantly, the thing that I want to leave you with is that this topic demonstrates that there is a significant difference between desegregation and integration. Desegregation is the end of legal ways to discriminate against fellow citizens. We can pass laws to stop discrimination. But we can't pass laws that correct those years of desegregation and the influence it still has. And we can't pass laws that remain which insist upon an integrated society. In other words, the movement hasn't ended. The struggle for an equitable, inclusive, diverse population of American citizens continues. And because it does, those words are targeted. What this topic teaches us is that with every movement toward a more beloved community represented by this nation's promise, there is going to be massive resistance to every step. We have to be more persistent than the opposition, because the opposition is always going to be there. What then, knowing this history, do we do about it now? The answer's up to you. Thank you so much for your time and attention. Oh, wow. Thank you. That's very humbling.
Yeah, I had to turn my chair where I could see it the whole time. Thank you, really, thank you. We're going to do questions and answers here in just a minute, but I'd like to share a few things. Oh, there we go. One second. Here we go. There we are. There are two women who thought this would be a great idea and put time and energy into it to be sure that we would have this presentation today. The first is Johnny May Perry. She's a director of the Gifford Historical Museum and Cultural Center, which you'll see right there. Here are some other images. This is some of the volunteers, and this is a student gathering, learning about Black history in Indian River County. You do a lot of great work there. Thank you. And the other woman is Laura Matson, chair of the Coalition for Racial Justice at this congregation. The Coalition for Racial Justice is planning a year of Black history here at the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of Vero Beach. If you'd like to see more programs like this, please, we're going to send around an offering. Please don't, give generously. And also, there was a little piece of paper we asked you to fill out when you came in. If you'd like to learn more about the coalition or some of the work that we're going to be doing, put those in the collection baskets as well. We don't have music for this, but we usually, in worship, we have like music while this is going on, but if we'd have a couple of people who could help us pass the basket around, that would be fantastic. Thank you very much. Now, one more thing before we get to the questions here. I want to show you 3 quick trailers of upcoming films that our social justice committee here is putting on here at UUFVB. These are what we call our social justice Friday night movies. And anyone is invited. March 21st will be Cowspiracy. We'll do all 3 of them in just a second. April 18th is Racially Charged, America's Misdemeanor Problem, which talked about the use of the misdemeanor against Black population. And May 16th. Now, the trailer for the one on May 16th says it's May 20th, but it really is May 16th. And the film is Before Juneteenth, Florida's Emancipations. Go ahead.
Misdemeanors have Misdemeanors have historically been the chump change crimes that we didn't pay attention to.
These laws didn't happen by chance. From the Reconstruction era to modern day, you see the fingerprints everywhere.
To sell prisoners into slavery, you first have to arrest lots of people.
You say you're going to jail, and I'm like, what for?
John Clark was convicted and was forced to work on a chain gang.
You're their slave with their shackle on your foot.
The problem isn't bad apple cops. The problem is the system is working the way it's supposed to.
Police shot this boy outside my apartment.
While Juneteenth is an important federal holiday, the true story of emancipation is much more complicated. It is often stated that Juneteenth is the oldest emancipation holiday, but Florida's emancipation is older. The fact is that emancipation was a complicated process, and it manifested in Florida in many different ways. A new mini-documentary, Before Juneteenth, Florida's Emancipations, details the evolution of freedom in the state. Produced by the South Florida People of Color and funded by Florida Humanities, Before Juneteenth premieres on Monday, May 20th, 2024 on YouTube. Visit FloridaEmancipationMay20.com for more information or follow Emancipation Florida on YouTube, Facebook, and Instagram.
Do you think there should be any concern of us making this documentary?
If you don't realize right now that you're putting your neck on the chopping block, you better take that camera and throw it away.
Let's look at the fundamental problem here.
They're looking to maximize the number of people making contributions.
No one wants to talk about it.
There's suppression and mismanagement of information everywhere it abounds.
It starts at the local level, but then it goes all the way to Congress.
When you consider the devastation it's having on our planet as well as the oceans.
And we're in the middle of the largest mass extinction of species in 65 million years.
They can dictate the federal policies because they have so much political power.
And one of the largest industries on the planet, the biggest environmental impact, trying to keep us in the dark about how it's operating.
That's the one thing no one talks about here. Everybody goes around that.
A lot of people just keep their mouths shut because they don't want to be the next one with the bullet to their head.
I don't know that I would want to comment on that.
Anyone is welcome to come and see those. We'll have speakers with them to lead discussions as well. One other, yeah. Please. Okay. March 21st is Cowspiracy at 7 o'clock in the lobby. April 18th, Racially Charged, America's Misdemeanor Problem. And May 16th, Before Juneteenth, Florida's Emancipations. Okay. All right. One other just quick announcement, and then we'll start in here. You'll notice as you go out the front door, there's a box. We're collecting food aid for the Farm Workers Association of Florida. We'll be soon collecting clothing as well for the immigrants in Fellsmere. If you're interested in donating, come by in the next couple of weeks and we'll have boxes out there for you to donate. Now, questions. I need a couple of volunteers. Here we are. If you'll raise your hands, I'll point to the folks. Okay, let's take that one over here on the left. Here, with raised hand, right behind you.
How many IRC school teachers are here today, or school administrators, and could you please stand?
Oh, school teachers and school administrators, could you please stand? Retired school teachers, administrators, please stand. Thank you. Okay, go ahead.
Hi.
we have, as Democrats in Indian River County, the Democratic governors, McKay, Graham, and Childs, are all kind of revered by our Democrats. I'm wondering if they had anything to do with the resistance against civil rights.
That's a good question. I would throw in Reuben Askew as well. Reuben Askew in the 1970s, I believe he served until 78, is another one. They don't have as much to do with the resistance. Where they are criticized is how far they didn't go, right? So it's not so much that they fell into the same pattern as the Fuller Warrens of Florida history or that group, but the Democratic governors are often criticized for not using their platform to push for more. Now, that could be for a variety of reasons, but there were advances made, but not as progressive as at times they could have been. And I'll give you a great example on Reuben Askew. He's from Pensacola, and his hometown was exploding during this period. And I found a note from his attorney general that basically said, you need to remain quiet on these issues because you have presidential ambitions. And to get involved here is to risk all of the future goodwill that you would have for Southern Democrats because Southern Democrats are beginning to leave the party. That was another part of my lecture that I left out because of time, but I mentioned how in the South, the Democrats, the white Democrats, the solid South, they actually shift. 68 is the beginning of that shift. And you see it in Florida. It's really due to, the mass outmigration of white Southerners from the Democratic Party begins in response to Lyndon Johnson with the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. Now, in Florida, where you see that happen for the first time is 1968, because in 1968, the Republican nominee was Richard Nixon, and the independent was George Wallace. George Wallace and Richard Nixon got 70.5% of the popular vote in Florida in 1968. 70% of the popular vote. Since then, the Democrats have not had the same level of success in this state that they did before. So again, this shift from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party, you can understand by looking at Florida first. And the Democrats, it's kind of like today. When the pendulum swings so far right, when it comes back, it's still going to be situated on the right. Right? And that's kind of the story of the Democratic Party in Florida, I believe, especially when you compare it to the national progressivism of the Democrats.
Okay, hands, let's see, right here? Yeah.
So public education in our country has been and continues to be in crisis. Yeah. And particularly what I've seen as a college educator is that my students are facing classrooms that are hard to manage, a wide variety of regulations that they need to face, and state standards where they need to try to fit everything in while also teaching AP and college education and what have you. But there's a more insidious problem in that these charter schools and homeschool curriculums that have taken over with folks like Mothers of Liberty. What advice would you give to the next generation of teachers of resilience when they are truly facing insurmountable odds? How can we encourage them who are underpaid, understaffed, overworked to go out and still have passion for teaching these subjects, because they're falling apart. They're facing a really hard time. And I know that you are an educator yourself. So what do you tell your students, this next group of educators?
First and foremost, I'm honest. There is a war on public education in this country. There has been for a while. And that's not a conspiracy theory, right? Right-wing advocacy groups have targeted, since before the 1980s, public education. Okay? And the reason that they're targeting public education is because they want to move to a privatized educational system through charter schools, vouchers. Okay? The problem with that, there are a few problems with that, but one of the main problems from a curricular standpoint is that the curriculum that is used by many of these private institutions is not accredited. So if you have a history program and a history curriculum that's provided by Hillsdale College or Prager University, you're going to get a very distorted view of the past. So make absolutely no mistake about it. The attack on public education, the attack on teachers, the attack on librarians, the attack on administrators, the attacks on school boards is a political strategy, and it has been a political strategy for some time, because making public education privatized is a tactic of control, okay? So I let my students know who want to be teachers what they're getting into. The first question I asked is, where do you want to teach? Quite honestly. Where? Do you want to go back to your home state? Do you want to stay in Florida? Okay. Second thing is, be very careful pertaining to the district to which you apply. Because what I've often seen is that it's not a statewide system. It often is a county-wide system. It's the 67 county system where some are more permissive and tolerant of topics being taught than others. St. Johns County, for instance, is a great example. They actually invited me for an in-service to do a presentation on the civil rights movement in St. Augustine. Whereas you have Osceola, who says no civil rights history for a teacher training. So because of the political situation or ambitions or origin of the superintendent and the position of the principal, that can make things a lot more complicated. The final thing that I say is go to your state standards if you're a teacher. That is your backing. State standards are dictated by the legislature. And many of these recommendations, many of these focus groups, these African American history engagement groups that are put together for political reasons, and they make recommendations like we can't talk about Rosewood, that's not binding on the state statutes. The educational standards have numbers, and Rosewood is mentioned. So make sure for teachers who want to do this, tie your curriculum and your primary sources, because you can't be accused of making up primary sources when they are actually the sources that historians use to write the histories. Make sure you tie it to that specific number. Make sure you have the support of your principal, and make sure your principal has the support of your superintendent. Now, the other thing that I think is worth mentioning is being honest with students about why they want to be teachers. Do you love education? Do you love history? Are you willing to step on landmines that you don't know exist? Because we can't predict the future. The hardest thing about teaching history is conveying to students that the people we're talking about don't know how the story ends. We don't know how this story ends. So are you willing to put yourself through this for what I consider to be a higher cause? And if there's any hesitation, it might not be the profession for them. So that's a long answer to a very difficult question about what do we do with it. What I do with it is convey honest information to the people that I come in contact with the understanding of what I said earlier. Education has always been a form of resistance in this country, and always will be, because it questions, it teaches students how to think critically, how to ask questions about those who hold positions of power.
And to just let you know, there is an organization here in Indian River County that is working very hard to keep the school system accountable. And I always say this, I say it like this: education champions, because they really are. They had an influence on the latest elections, and so that we now have, I think, a better board, so that, again, some of the school board meetings can be boring, and that students are treated well and educated well in this county. If you're interested in learning more about that, is there anybody from Education Champions here? Yeah, go talk to them. I attend as well, but I'm sort of an ex officio. Okay, another question. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. This has been wonderful. I'm curious about faith-based motivations and involvement, especially in Florida. I'm wondering if you could just comment on that and if there's any sources that might give some good history on that.
Yeah, that's a great question as well. It really depends on the local campaign because just like I said, the campaigns are local in nature, so too is the involvement of faith-based communities, right? For instance, if you want to look at one of the largest examples of faith-based collaboration between white people in the movement, look at the Miami movement, and you're going to see a large Jewish contingent that is involved with the movement there. You don't see that in places like Jacksonville, Orlando. In St. Augustine, you're going to see the Catholic Church play a very different role because of the diocese there than it does in Pensacola, for instance, right? And the other thing, if we talk about faith-based organization, the role that historically in rural areas the Baptist and Methodist Church plays in resisting the civil rights movement is also important because you have some people who argue that the Bible demands segregation. So, that's why we have a Southern Baptist Convention. Our nation reunited after the Civil War. The Baptist, Methodist, and Episcopalian churches never did. Okay? So that's a complicated question because it really depends on the local struggle and the degree to which the faith-based organizations in that community do or don't get involved. Now, the other thing is look at the Black church, the AME church, the AME Zion church. Okay, that's going to play a much different role, sometimes in the same place that the White Baptist Church does for poor whites. So, to your point, do faith-based organizations, not just churches, but faith-based organizations play a role in the movement? Everywhere. Sometimes they're on different ends of that fight. But it is the community struggle that sort of opens the door through which we can answer questions about that. Because, it's not a cop-out, but it sounds like a cop-out to say it depends. It depends on where, and it depends on when.
I'm going to ask one question just because I get a chance up here. We were talking last night about some of the courses that you teach, and I think it's very interesting. And in case you didn't know, these courses are being taught right now. And I think it's important for us to know that these are still available to students in some of our colleges. And I think they're important courses. Could you tell us what you're teaching right now?
Yeah, right now I'm teaching a sophomore level. It's not a freshman level class, sophomore, junior level class on the civil rights movement, the national movement. So it's kind of like the intro into. And my senior level class is the Florida civil rights movement, which is the basis for this lecture actually came from the Florida civil rights movement class. So yeah, when people ask, do you have the freedom to teach these classes at your institution? Yes, because Flagler College, number one, is a private institution. Right? We don't get a majority of our funding from the state. We do get some funding, and if you've ever been to St. Augustine, it costs a lot of money to keep those buildings looking nice and pretty. So we have state appropriations there, and our president walks a fine line between allowing academic freedom, which he believes in, and also trying to stay off the state's radar. That's, quite frankly, that's what a college president is supposed to do. As long as we have the president in place now that we do at our college, I feel protected. I feel that these classes won't be subject to administrative oversight. But I have colleagues in public schools who have to submit their syllabi, who have to explain why they teach certain topics on their syllabus that they teach, who have to sign basically what I call it is a loyalty oath from the McCarthy era that says, I will not teach divisive topics in my classroom. So just like the movement depends on the location, asking these questions about do you have the freedom to do X, Y, and Z really depends on where you are, who the president is, and what the circumstances of that campus are right now. Because if you've kept up with higher education news in Florida, one of the things that's happened that is the poster child of why we should be frightened is New College. And the president at New College applied to be the current president of Flagler College. So I am not naive in understanding that while I have the freedom now, I'm going to take advantage of it, and I'm going to use it because I think it's a professional and a moral obligation that I have to teach these topics, okay? Otherwise, I'll become part of the problem in keeping it quiet out of fear or whatever. The other thing is the genie's kind of out of the bottle. I've kind of been on stage talking about these topics. I'm not going to be quiet now. It can change. It can change.
Regardless if it changes, we want to have you back. So,
oh, thank you.
All right, go ahead.
First, thank you.
Thank you.
In deference to the next gen, I'm a proud volunteer at the museum with Johnny May and the Gifford Museum. I would say, what would be a recommendation to make that successful for the next gen, knowing the challenges that are in front of us?
The younger generation, and I say the generation that I teach, they often get a bad reputation. You know, they're always on their phones, they're lazy. Every generation has said that about the one following it, by the way. They don't like their music, their hair is too long. They're entitled, they're lazy, they didn't work as hard. What I will say about students now is that because of social media, they are finding their communities. It may not be the same form of activism and the same form of organization that we're used to as middle-aged adults, right? But social media gives them a chance to find their communities, and they are organizing, and they are talking to people. I advise young people to find their communities, to find those platforms where they exist, because they do exist, number one. Number two, don't give up on the vote. And not just the vote at national levels. These members of Planned Parenthood, Moms for Liberty, I'm sorry. These members of Moms in Liberty get into power in Florida often through dozens of votes. And that is a concerted effort to politicize what has been historically in Florida a nonpartisan governing board. If young people understood that you literally have women who want to make decisions, not for their kids, that's parental rights. A parent's right is not to determine what every student in a school reads, doesn't learn. If students understood that these school board elections will have an impact on your college future, because let me tell you, there are colleges, administrators that I know who are saying, we are looking really closely at applicants who come from Florida because we want to know what kind of education they're getting. Right? If students understand that these local elections could have an impact on your college decisions, then maybe that would inspire them to think a little more about local elections and the power of the vote there as much as they do the presidential elections. So, look, and the other thing that I really stress in my classes, and that's a great question about the next generation, is that the movement teaches us it's the next generation that changed the country. It's students. It's the Children's Campaign of 1963 in Birmingham. It's the sit-ins. It's SNCC. It's CORE, right? It's young people that had the courage and the lack of responsibilities, quite frankly, to make this nation a better one for more of us.
Sorry, one more question, because you are terrific. And I am wondering about publicizing one of the, I think is the best source, and I'm wondering what you think of Wikipedia and what they're putting into the history in Wikipedia, because it seems like if you put in a lot of things, have you?
I haven't put anything in Wikipedia. What I will say is that what scares me more than Wikipedia right now is artificial intelligence. because what
Yes.
ChatGPT in particular does is that it takes knowledge from around the World Wide Web and kind of condenses it. So what I tell students is that ChatGPT is not always correct.
Exactly.
Right? And it is condensing a lot of bad faith information that's out there and presenting it as if it's fact. Wikipedia is actually now more of a reliable source than it was even 5 years ago because of direct citation. Right? When you read Wikipedia now, look for the citation. If it's not cited, then you can question the material. But if it has a citation, you could always go to that citation. So it's really funny because 10 years ago, Wikipedia was to educators what ChatGPT is now. It's the Wild West. You can make it to where Elvis killed JFK on Wikipedia and nobody will challenge it. And that's not the case anymore.
No.
But now,
They lock the sites.
yeah, you have artificial intelligence that is artificial but not real intelligent. So that's again the importance of history. History forces you to learn how to read carefully, think critically, write better, and ask good questions. Right? So that's what a history-based education trains us to do. Yeah, it teaches us what we learn today, but I didn't give you just facts. It is connecting dots and thinking critically about how X impacts Z and how Z kind of brings us back to A. That's the power of education, particularly a liberal arts-based education. So I get what you're saying about online information. Another thing is that we have more access to sources than we've ever had and less understanding of how to use it. And we need to start focusing on not the information that exists, but how do you use the information that's available, because that's become a lost art as well. So, yeah, I'm with you with the challenges.
Yeah, could you have your students put everything on Wikipedia, all that you're teaching? How's that?
It would be changed.
Do you have any students, do you come across any students in your class who challenge you, who give you, well, yeah, sure, but, you know, kind of an attitude? And also, I mean, you're a private institution, so you attract applicants, students, who have a certain premonition or desire for your type of education. And all institutions have, you know, it's in their mission statement, blah, blah, blah. But they have a motivation of what they want their students to know, a philosophy. Yeah. And so those are really two questions, and there's so many more I'd like to ask.
I have never, and this is one of the big myths, I think, in this manufactured crisis of wokeism, is that students are being indoctrinated. Okay, so number one, my undergraduate institution was a Jesuit college, so, you know, I'm really inspired by I'm not here to tell you what to think, I'm here to teach you how to think kind of mindset. And I say that almost every semester. The second thing that I say is that if you have a problem with anything that I say, find the evidence that contradicts what I'm teaching. Please. We can have a conversation about conflicting evidence, but we can't have a conversation about conflicting opinions that you have about the facts that I expose you to. Okay? So I'm always willing to say, I'll hear your side, your objection, but bring me some evidence. I want to see receipts, because I've got plenty. I don't make this stuff up. Okay? Indoctrination, I don't care. I say I don't care. I think history does teach empathy, and it's one of the few disciplines that does. It puts you in the position of people that you have nothing in common with and helps see their perspectives in ways that you wouldn't ordinarily think of. But at the end of the day, I'm not in the conversion business. I'm in the education business, right? And I've had those conversations with students before in private, and they're like, I didn't know any of this stuff, and it's not what I've been taught in my church or in my school. And you know who they get mad at? Not me. They get mad at their parents, their preachers, and their former teachers for not telling them the truth. Okay? So the other thing about indoctrination, I'm going to just tell y'all, teachers, y'all get this. I can't get my students to do all the reading. How am I indoctrinating people? They're barely passing tests. I wish I was as powerful as these politicians portray me as being. Name a library after me or something, you know. So, yes, do I have people who push back? Not publicly, but I welcome it. I welcome it because that's part of the education process, right? And your second question was, so I'll make sure I answer that. Yes. Okay, so I always go back to our institutional core values, and one of our core values is a diverse, respectful, a diverse and inclusive campus. Exactly. For the time being, that's right. So when I'm accused of, or anybody says we are not going to talk about this, it's one of our core mission statements. It's one of our core values. We're going to change that? So that's one of those political whoopsies, you know? So, yeah, I always go back to the mission statement to say, this is what we're trying to do as an institution. Oh. So, yeah.
I have another question.
Yes, sir.
I have not heard you say these words, white Christian nationalism.
It's a problem.
And it's a problem. Yes, I agree with you. It's a problem. So one of the book that's going around right now in those circles is The Sin of Empathy. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that. So you talked about empathy.
I don't understand how far the evangelical church has come. It's almost like they're reading a different scripture now than the one that I was exposed to in a pretty fundamentalist church when I was younger. It's definitely not the same scripture the Jesuits taught from. Quite frankly, I think white Christian nationalism is a bastardization of the scriptures done for political purposes. And one of the quotes from Jesus that I always come back to is that you will know them by their fruits. And I'm sorry, but having empathy for the less fortunate is one of the fundamental teachings of the Christian church, period. I don't know how you get around that. There are so many parables that we're told that all come back to that. And it is almost a deliberate, willing ignorance to declare empathy a sin. But if it's a movement that's based on exclusivity, anger, and self-righteousness, then maybe it is easy to look at empathy as a sin.
Thank you. We have time for one more question, and anybody?
I have
okay.
just a clarification that for you that the evangelical church is actually, there's a divide in the evangelical church. So it's not, you can't paint it all one way or the other. So that's all. Because some of us really do believe the scriptures.
Good point. Yeah, good point. Good point. I'm thinking about my own bubble.
Okay, one more question in the back. Okay.
Just a question about the, well, I'll mention the name Elon Musk and this idea of the technocrats and what they see as our future. What does that mean for race relations that we have an Elon Musk, in such a position, and his ideas of putting folks out of work through AI and giving them a supplemental salary? These ideas, what do you think of these ideas?
Where is Elon Musk from?
South Africa.
What system did he come of age in?
Apartheid.
Huh. What has our current president said about the most discriminated against group in the public sector now? Who is the most discriminated?
White people.
White men in particular. The layoffs hurt marginalized people's entry-level positions the worst. And when there's no capacity demonstrated for human empathy or admitting that prior beliefs were erroneous, then I think we can expect more of the same. And sometimes cruelty is the point. And I think that has been made abundantly clear in the rhetoric surrounding our current president's political, domestic, and racial political agendas, all the way from the Central Park Five to the fact that his company has been successfully sued by the federal government for racially discriminatory practices, the comments that he made about people of color who were in his employ through Charlottesville, through the military, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, when it comes to race relations, economic policies are a reflection on the way that people in power view those of color.
Go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Butler. It was fascinating. It was magnificent. In this atmosphere of our current administration trying to eradicate DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, which you came, 3 years ago and did a presentation for AAUW when I was state chair of DEI. I just want to say to all of you, thank you for gracing us with your presence. It is a diverse audience, an inclusive audience, and we walk away with equity of knowledge. Thank you for coming.
Again, thank you all for coming. Keep your eye out for future events.